Ms. Bjork.
Thank you, Chair Williams. I'm Rebecca Bjork, Water Resources Manager, and today I'm here to give you a presentation on proposed rate increases for water and wastewater. I'm going to start with the Water Fund. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about the Water Fund. It is, all of our revenues are derived from rates that people pay when they use water. We read their water bills, their water meters, and determine their rates. Our projected revenue for 2011 is $34,782,686. Of that, operations, the operating budget will account for $31 million, and $3.3 million will be used for the capital budget. I want to point out this is a balanced budget, which is more of an accident than anything. And as I get into the presentation, I'll show you how we do multi-year budget planning and fund planning for this program, because our capital can vary significantly from year to year. So what we want to make sure is that over the course of years, we're staying above council policy reserves. In terms of where our money goes, most of our costs are pretty much fixed. Our salaries are 22% of our costs, and this work group did participate in salary reductions last year. Obviously, they're not done with negotiations yet, but they have addressed salaries to the extent that they can. We are mandated in many of our facilities in our staffing level, how many people we have to have on site. So we have limited ability to address. Debt service is fixed. Salaries are relatively fixed. Materials and supplies are driven by the need of the system. Our allocated costs are the costs we pay for support from other departments within the city, such as the attorney's office and finance. Water purchases account for 24% of our budget, and a lot of that goes to pay for the state water project, our debt to the state water project, as well as the operating costs for the Kachuma project. So that's about $7 million. And then the capital is the one piece that year to year we can sort of change in order to make sure that we have adequate money in reserves. And this is the same basic information, but given to you as by dollar value, so you can see the magnitude of this, of the size of these different activities. Significant for 2011, we do have a planned rate increase, and when I say planned, about 6 years ago we came to council with a 10-year rate plan, actually a financial plan, looking at what we foresaw as our needs over the next 10-year period, and a rate plan to meet those needs. And at that time, council did approve that rate plan. Obviously, we have to come back each year to identify and activate the rate increases. So although the plan's been approved, the rate increases have to be approved each year. Next year, we're anticipating 13,800 acre-feet of water sales. That's down significantly from what we anticipated for last year, but up slightly from what we're actually going to see this year. We're looking at about 13,300 acre-feet of sales this year. So we can't tell exactly where this will be. It's mostly a function of climate. We've had a fairly wet spring. If it's very dry, we may have much higher sales. In 2009, we had 15,000 acre-feet of sales. So that's our best estimate for what we'll get for revenue. In terms of costs, we have some significant operational costs that have increased in the last couple of years that I just wanted to make sure you're aware of. Our staffing costs at Cater include an extra $85,000 in overtime for our operators there, and that's because we have only 4 licensed operators that have the required licensing to operate that plant. We have had significant retirements from this work group in the last couple of years, and we have been recruiting and filling the positions to get people trained and ready to be licensed, but they are not yet licensed, and we don't anticipate them being licensed until at least the second part of the fiscal year. So we have increased the overtime budget in order to be able to pay those 4 licensed operators to give us shift coverage. The other really significant and ongoing effect to the water fund is the cost of treating water after the Zaka fire. Before Zaka, and just briefly, Zaka put an awful lot of organic material into the water when it rained. So the fire burned all summer, and then we had a huge rainfall in the winter, and it washed all the organic material into the water, and it's much more expensive to remove that plant-based material from the water than the water we used to have. So we're essentially seeing about $2 million a year in costs over what we used to spend for treating the water. As I said, we do a 10-year plan for our rates to try and make sure that we are able to stay above reserves. And I just want to go quickly over this chart. The council has three kinds of reserves that they've adopted as policy. The first being the budget reserve, which is 10% of the operating budget. The economic reserve, which is 15%, and the capital reserve, which is tied to our capital program expenditures. And the economic reserve for water and wastewater is an important reserve because we are subject to revenue decreases in drought. So if we had a severe drought like we had in 1990, we saw our revenues decline significantly. And the economic reserves in this situation would provide a reserve for that kind of situation. The black line shows the actual amount of money that will be in reserves at the end of the fiscal year. So at the end of fiscal year 2011, we expect to have $16 million in reserves. However, by 2012, based on our program of work in our capital program, that will be drawn down to $12 million. This chart also incorporates the funded projects that are included in the capital improvement program that was presented to Council a couple of weeks ago, I think, a month ago. It does not include the unfunded projects. As I said, we sort of try to make our capital work within our rate plan. So this anticipates the funded projects, but I will talk a little bit more about the unfunded projects in a minute. Councilmember Williams did ask me to do a sensitivity analysis. This shows what would happen if we took a one-year break from rate increases. So just this year we said we're not going to do any rate increases, but we'll continue doing the 3.5% rate increases in the future. That isn't sustainable with our current capital program. This looks at 0.5%, and I'm going to go through these quickly because they're pretty redundant. It just shows you how the line moves up with each 0.5% of increase, 3%, and then this is the proposed 3.5%. I also wanted to talk a little bit about our unfunded needs. Water main replacement, this is sort of how we make sure that we stay within that rate plan, is we have been deferring water main replacement needs. And for the next 6-year period, we are able to fully fund the water main program in 2011 because we're able to move some money for the groundwater program that we got a loan for into the main program. But in 2012 through 2016, we're looking at funding only about half what we need for main replacement in order to keep up with the council goal of 1% per year. If we did fully fund the program in order to have the main replacement stay at that 1% per year level, this is what it would do to our financial plan. And that's the reason we're not fully funding it. In terms of putting our rates in context with other districts, our current rate is that bottom bar of 61.39. The assumptions here are that this is a typical single-family residence using 12 units or 100 cubic feet of water. 100 cubic feet of water is 750 gallons. So, and this is sort of our typical household. For that typical household, we would expect their bill to go up to $63.57. And then I've given the other South Coast water districts for comparison to show relative costs. And this slide shows our rates in comparison to all of the other county water districts. And you can see that we're fairly close. I want to point out that this slide uses a slightly different standard. It's comparing 10 units of use. And you can see for 10 units of use, we're just over $50, which brings up the point that water conservation can make a big difference to your bill. I wanted to just show you this is what the increase to that bill would be based on the different percentage increases to the rates. So if it was a 0.5% increase, it'd be 30 cents. It's basically just about a little over 30 cents per 0.5%, or a little over 60 cents per percent. As I said, water conservation can make a big difference to this bill. People do have an ability to control their expense by conserving water. These are some data that were generated from facilities where we've had conservation implemented. On average, putting in a low-flow toilet can save you $12.50 a month. And these are projects that we have rebates for. So we either completely fund. For low-flow toilets, the rebate covers the cost of the toilet. For the high-efficiency washers, I think it buys down the cost. But the rain sensors are also free through our rebate program. And that, you can see, is significant. Obviously, this is average, so everyone wouldn't see that. But there are significant opportunities for savings through conservation. And then I wanted to talk about agricultural rates, because every year agricultural rates are brought up by the ag community as being a concern to them. Recently, in response to concerns from the agricultural community, the council did increase their allotment. The way that the ag rates are done, they're given a certain amount of water to use in a year. And it used to be about 1.5 acre feet per acre of land, so about enough water to cover that land and 1.5 feet high. In 2008, that amount was increased to 1,080, which is about 2.5 acre feet per acre. So enough water to cover their land 2.5 feet in water. And we allowed them to have carryover from one year to the next. So if they didn't use all of that allotment in the first year, they could carry it into the next year in case it was a drought or dry period, or if they had extra needs. This is very much how we manage our water supplies for the city. It allows us to save up water when it's wet and use it in periods when it's dry. Additionally, in 2009, Council did reduce the agricultural rates from $1.51 to $1.45. This is our agricultural rate. Second bar from the bottom is the current rate of $1.45 per unit, and the next is the proposed rate, 3.5% increase at $1.50 per unit, and it shows that we're the average of the other users, which is intentional. Water Commission recommended to Council that we be the average of the South Coast agencies last year. And this shows the other current city irrigation rates. You can see recycled water, historically recycled water was our cheapest rate. It's set to be 20% below other irrigation rates because you do need extra water to wash the salts in the recycled water through the root zone, and also as an inducement to people to want to willingly switch over. Commercial and residential irrigation is about $4.70 a unit. Irrigation for some of our other public benefit type of uses, such as parks and schools, is at $2.27 a unit, and agriculture is at $1.45 currently. And that's the water fund. I can go on to wastewater unless you want to ask questions on water first.
Questions, Councilmember Self.
Thank you. When you considered water rates, is that just for the lowest block rate? Because it gets more expensive as you use more water.
That's correct. The water rates, the proposed water rates are across the board increases. And the block rate structure, where the least amount of water is the cheapest, is a important part of our conservation effort, and it's really our strongest conservation tool. So we set the block 1 water amount at just a little bit less than we expect a typical household to use, because we want it to be a conservation incentive. We want people to be aware of how much water they're using and try and conserve it. Our cost for treating water, if we had a flat rate and all of our water was charged at the same cost, would be about $3.90 a unit. So our block 1 rates are set below that in order to offer people an incentive to conserve, but having the higher levels above that is necessary in order to meet our expenses.
Yes, and I guess when you did the comparisons between, say, Goleta and Carpinteria to us, do they also have block rate billing, and are we starting at the lower, or did we give the average of?
We tried to compare apples to apples. So we looked at, if you have a single family home using 12 acre feet 12 units of water in Goleta or Montecito, what would their bill be? So it's not comparing their block rates, but comparing what a customer using the same amount of water in one of those agencies to what we would be paying.
Right. So, and they all bill in block rate?
Montecito has recently converted to it. Carpinteria has a different approach altogether. They have a water budget where they allocate a certain amount on a house-by-house basis, and if you use more than that, you pay more. Each of the districts does it a little bit differently, but increasingly districts have gone to block rate structures.
Thank you.
I'll just also give you the background that the block rate structure tends to conserve water more, and the Montecito just went to it because of the need for Montecito to be able to conserve water additionally. So it's especially an inducement to large users to reduce their water usage. I'm trying to understand this with the unfunded needs and water main replacement issue, and it is the fact that the unfunded amounts and sort of spirals down the
Trying to
amount
get
of
back there.
reserves. And that would be if we were spending $2.25 million per year out of reserves.
This, it would be $2.25 million a year more than we're, yes, right, if we pulled that out of the reserves each year.
So about what percentage of the system are we replacing right now?
We're funding between a little bit less than 0.5% per year. We're funding at about half of the level that we would need to fund full replacement at the 1% level.
And what's the lifetime of one of these
It depends. We have pipes in the ground from 1886 that are functioning fine. Some of our worst pipe was installed in the 50s and 60s. Cast iron pipe that breaks much more frequently, not as good materials. So that seems to be coming to the end of its useful life. It's what we are targeting most for replacement. Unfortunately, it also represents a big portion of our system because we had a lot of growth in the 50s and 60s. So it really depends on the materials, how it was installed, and the type of soil it's in. We between 50 and 100 years.
And do you think if we say funded the 2012 amount, because there's not very much time to come up with that $2.25 million, if we could add that into our sensitivity analysis?
One at a time, 1 year at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can actually just see what would happen if you this shows funding it every year at the full level. So if we go, sorry, I'm so slow. If you look at 2012, that would if you're just looking at that 1 year, that would give you that answer. It stays above reserves, and that's
Right.
intentional. We're funding that program in a way that we can afford.
Right. It's just that, just sort of philosophically, the idea of what a capital reserve is for is to address capital needs. The basic capital need is water main replacement. So it seems to me not necessarily not follow much logic to defer maintenance when we have a capital reserve.
And one of the things this fund has been struggling with is we have had a lot of expensive mandates in the last decade. We had a $20 million project at Cater, a $20 million project to replace the reservoirs, and we're looking at another $20 million project at Cater, and that's
For ozonation.
a lot to absorb. And then you will notice that the impact to the water operating budget was about $2 million a year, and that was not built in when we did this planning. We didn't have any knowledge of that increased expense for water treatment. So that's been a significant effect on this fund as well.
So it's important for the public to understand that the need for rate increases is largely derived from federal mandates, that the federal government gives us certain mandates on water quality and no money to actually implement that. So we've just got to comply with them, and that's that.
Yeah, the really expensive things. Of course, even without that, we'd have the expense of ongoing maintenance of our system, but the federal mandates really have been a significant expense in the last decade.
Well, I've been thinking long and hard both about what you said at the last hearing, Councilmember Self, and about the what the members of the public said, and I think I am leaning towards the idea of supporting a slightly lower, but not radically lower rate increase for the year, and I guess what I would propose as a recommendation is to reduce it from a 3.5 to a 3% or a 2.5%, but probably 3% with funding the water main replacement for fiscal year 2012. I think probably by fiscal year 2013 we might be better on track to implement some of the recommendations that the committee handling the long-term capital needs was making in terms of recommendations to council. None of those recommendations we've really been able to go forward because of the economic times that we are in. But it's hard for me to see us having a solution by FY 2012. And so it seems to me that we should be funding the water main replacement for 2012. And if we do not do more than use capital reserves, I don't see a problem with doing that. So I don't know if that's something that you're interested in, but my thought was to recommend to council a 3% rate increase instead of a 3.5% rate increase while funding the FY12 unfunded needs for capital replacement.
I have another question, but I was thinking more in the range of 2%, and beginning to understand a little bit how enterprise funds pay something for their payroll and something for their this. There have been several water main replacements that have been due to bulb out installation at Chapala and Anapamu. You saw where that was dug up, and we have this water main that's going straight, and now it has to go out and then up and then back again. I believe that the expense for that should not be the burden of water main replacement. That should be an expense to our streets fund because it is a requirement of bulb outs. And so I think we're seeing a deflated cost for bulb outs, and we need to see an accurate amount from the engineering department. When the bulb outs were put down on Lower Chapala Street, my understanding was that cost the water department $250,000. That's a lot of coin. And so I think it should be charged appropriately, not put on the backs of the water rate payers.
And Councilmember Self, we shared that concern, and when those projects went forward, the mains that needed to be moved because of the bulb outs were charged to streets. The mains that were replaced because the street was dug up and it was an opportune time to get to the infrastructure, and it actually lowered our costs for accessing it because we're already there and working. Water paid for the ones that needed to be done for infrastructure renewal purposes, and the ones that were done only because of the streets impacts were paid by streets.
That's good to know. You're on it. Thanks.
Well, I'll
And excuse me.
I guess my one problem that I would have with only having 2% rate increases, we would not have enough funds to address the capital needs in the near future.
And
Maybe we could split the difference.
Councilmember Williams and Self, I just want to say that if you drop this line down by 2%, what you will do is it will, on either of those alternatives, if you take $2 million additional in 2012, which is what we'll need to fully fund that program, that line will go down and stay down. So the point that right now is at about 12 million will drop down to 10 million, and then you can just draw a parallel line below that. It'll just be a mirror of it. So we will
Right.
be in reserves.
So I think I'd be okay with splitting the difference at 2.5 because then that would still give us the 2.25 million necessary to
Right,
address
and
those capital.
I agree, and I'm all for ionized water. Sometimes the government pushes us into things that we wish they'd fund it too, but they don't. Having been to communities that have ionized water, it's a really big benefit. We put in a whole house filter that takes out chloramine, chlorine and all of that because chlorine makes me itch. So I think, if it makes you itch, it's doing other things to you too. Hopefully this will not be an ongoing trend, but I think at a time when our community is suffering financially, I'd like to see it come down just a little bit for now. Thank you.
So can I get a motion on for...
Do you want to take separate ones, or okay? And I do want to let you know that Water Commission did recommend 3.5% across the board rate increases.
Okay. Do you want to make a recommendation?
I'd like to make a recommendation that the water rate be increased 2.5% this year.
With funding of FY 2012 water main replacement.
Yes.
And I'll second that. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? I'll be the recommendation. On to wastewater.
Okay. Okay, wastewater. The wastewater fund is a substantially smaller fund than water, although it really has almost as much infrastructure to maintain, which makes it a little bit more challenging on the capital side. Our revenues are close to $15 million. Our operational costs are $13. This year we're proposing a $4.2 million capital program, which will require the use of $2.5 million in reserves. Like the water fund, many of our costs are pretty fixed. Our capital program cost for this next year will be 25% of the total cost. The lateral program is something I want to talk about in a little bit, but it is an incentive program where if people replace or repair their lateral, they can receive reimbursement of up to $2,000. It's a great program. It's just very expensive for us. This year we're spending close to $1 million on it. We've budgeted $700,000 for it for next year. But we will be back to talk to council about it because it's a challenge for us to fund that as well as our infrastructure maintenance. Materials and supplies are 24%, allocated costs are 10%, and debt service, which is the 2004 bonds, is 8%. And these are the values of those. This is the wastewater fund projection with the current adopted capital plan and our projections for revenues and expenses. And I haven't done any sensitivity analysis on this. We cannot, this year, raise rates by more than 4% because we have sent out our Prop 218 notice that limits rate increases to 4%. And I can't see recommending doing any less than 4% given this picture. We have some real capital needs in the wastewater system connected to the wastewater plant particularly. It's a 30-year-old plant. It basically needs an overhaul much like we did on Cater in the last decade, and those are expensive projects. We do have some ideas about how to try and make that picture look a little bit better. We've applied for a state revolving fund loan that would fund some of the more expensive projects at the El Estero plant and allow that cost to be spread out over the lifetime of those projects for about 20 years. That's a very low interest loan. We are hopeful that we will get that loan, and we're crossing our fingers that the state will have the money to fund the loan. But that would help a lot in addressing the immediate needs of the wastewater system. We will be asking council to reevaluate the sewer lateral incentive program. At the Water Commission meeting yesterday, Water Commission recommended putting the sewer lateral program on hold for a year. And there's always the alternative of deferring capital, which doesn't address the problem, but it does push it out to the future. This is what the wastewater plan would look like if we stopped doing the sewer lateral incentive program. And that means not just stopping for next year, but stop doing it. That reflects the decreased expenditure of $700,000 a year. The unfunded projects in wastewater are more significant than water. You can see that the main rehab program is underfunded fairly significantly. That's sort of what had to give to be able to afford the bigger projects at the treatment plant. But we also have unfunded needs at the plant identified in 2016, as well as fairly significant needs in our lift stations out in the collection system. We are the least costly of the South Coast agencies. We are currently at about $33 for a typical household. And it's important to know that wastewater rates, unlike water rates, are capped. So that if you use more than 10 units of water for a single-family residence, and it's less for multifamily residents, you don't pay any more on wastewater. So that it's capped. So that's the maximum rate. We're proposing to have it go up 4% to 34.21. The rate adoption process, we were at Water Commission yesterday. We're here today. We will have a Prop 218 hearing on June 15th and seek direction of council at that time, and the rates will be adopted with the budget. And that's wastewater.
Questions?
Well, I think I would agree that the sewer lateral program could be eliminated now that people have gotten into that. I have a question. Is it mandated that you have a sewer lateral inspection at the time of sale?
No, it is not.
It's recommended.
It's recommended. We on the inspection that's done at the transfer by the planning people, they note whether or not the line has been inspected, but it is not mandated. There was significant resistance to that particular option.
I have one other question. On the bill, we're charged for meters. We're kind of going
Right.
back to water again, but do other communities also charge a meter fee?
Yes, that's very common, and that there's a fixed component to your bill, which is the meter fee. And as you saw, most of our costs are fixed, but most of our revenues are variable. The fixed portion is the meter fee, and that's basically the baseline cost of providing service to your house. Because whether you're using any water or not, there is a cost in having your house connected and having the ability to provide you service.
Okay, thank you.
Question on this plan. So what the water committee recommended was to defer the sewer lateral maintenance program for this year and not fund the main rehab.
The Water Commission we will be bringing the sewer lateral program to council separately, and they heard that as a separate item. They didn't hear it as part of the rate item, but they recommended stopping the program for a year. This picture that shows without the lateral incentive program, the only difference here is that we're not spending $700,000 a year for laterals. It doesn't include any increases to the pipeline replacement program.
I guess I would have the same issue that I spoke of in the water concerning the water plan. To me, to try to avoid spending capital reserves at the same time that you're deferring, $2 million worth of maintenance every year doesn't make any sense. That's so if we did suspend the sewer lateral program, I would want to see us invest in the main rehab, at least for the coming year, because $2.6 million worth of unfunded projects in the next fiscal year. Well, do we have any other plan for funding those projects?
The problem is really balancing the needs of the whole system. I mean, the pipelines need replacing. The plant is critically in need of replacing. And if we take money away from the plant, we're at risk of violating the permit, which gets us into mandatory penalties, which starts draining on the plant on the fund in a different way. So it's been an issue of we've had 20 years of good pipeline replacement projects. We still need to continue that. We really do. But given the relative priorities in this particular program, the highest need right now is getting some of these plant projects done. And the only way we can afford to do it, given our current financial plan, is to defer the maintenance on the pipes for a period of time.
And when I took office, I seem to remember we were doing about 1% replacement a year.
That was the aim, yes.
And what are we doing
We're
now?
probably, with this funding, we'd be down significantly below that.
But what have we been
And we've
doing?
been staying close. We've been being maybe 0.7 to 0.9.
Okay. I guess that this maybe the complexity of this might be best saved for council as a whole, but my personal recommendation would be that you give us the cost benefit of the main rehab versus the sewer laterals, and I would invest in one or the other. If we're not going to invest in the sewer lateral, we need to be investing in main rehab. To me, a capital reserve is to prevent you from deferring maintenance. So I guess I just don't
And I'd like
get
to,
it why it looks like our strategy is to touch it as little as possible.
I think that one of the things that we count on the capital reserve for beyond preventing deferred maintenance is emergencies. If we had an emergency where our infrastructure is extremely expensive to replace, and the $2 million in capital reserve there is about the cost of our pipeline, our influent pump replacement. If we had a major pipe collapse, we could easily use up $1 million. So unanticipated projects and unanticipated needs for the system are an important thing for our capital reserves, as well as making sure that we're not deferring maintenance.
I guess just have a kind of difference of opinion that it seems to me like that we have capital reserves, we have economic reserves, and we have what we would in the general fund called emergency reserves, but I guess you guys call it here budget reserves. An emergency is what the last bit of those reserves is for. The first bit of reserves is to make sure that we're not doing anything dumb and short-sighted by not spending the necessary amount of money to replace capital. And the economic reserves, I suppose, is somewhere in the middle of what that is. And so I would hope that we would at least feature the discussion of the costs and benefits, and whether we could, if we suspended the sewer lateral program, at least invest in main rehab more than we are doing currently.
Is that a motion?
Sure, if you would like, absolutely. Is that
Yeah.
Okay? Then I will move the recommendation from the Finance Committee that if Council chooses to suspend the sewer lateral program, that we will invest heavier in main rehab, at least for the FY11.
If I could?
Sure, Mr. Smart.
Just recognizing a couple of things. One, that the capital reserves, or any of the reserves for that matter, are one-time money. So it's really saying we're going to invest in 1 year,
Right.
Additionally than what we would normally be able to invest by using some of those capital reserves. So again, it's one time for sort of ongoing needs. And secondly, we do have a policy requiring that we have those reserves fully funded. And it's at some point that, and the policy does say that if you're going to use them on a one-time basis, that you should have a plan for restoring them. So it just sort of defers the need to raise rates perhaps later, or defer capital later in order to replenish those reserves. So it's really a one-time sort of measure for 1 year's funding of additional maintenance of whether it be main rehab or any other project.
Could you tell me what the difference between FY18 and 19? Why are we spending that much money in FY18 and 19?
This is, if you look back to the other chart that I had. As I said, this is our attempt to try and we plan in our capital improvement plan. We plan out through fiscal year 16. In our fund, we try and look a little bit longer term than that, because it takes a lot of time to develop and complete these projects. But what you're seeing is fiscal year 19 is $9 million in projects that we've identified as needing to do that we know we can't afford to do. So we've pushed them off to the end of the rate planning. We've deferred that maintenance. Those are projects that are out there that will need to be done at some time that we realize we can't fund at this point.
So, in other words, if we recommended that you do main rehab in FY 2011, the amount that's unfunded, then you would have that much less to do in 18-19.
We would either have to come back. That in fact is not showing the unfunded sewer mains. This is other work.
What kind of projects is
digester, pump replacement, replacement of the system for our sludge handling, major plant process improvement or rehabilitation that's needed.
Well, I think that I think we would probably, to make the best decision, need to know what might happen after FY19 if we were to go ahead. But to me, you already have a plan for getting to Mr. Samario's point. You already have, if we suspend the sewer lateral program, we already have a plan for getting back into fully funded reserves. You're just projecting so far out that it becomes more and more difficult to really plan that.
I really want to point some out. This is the current plan. So
Right.
As you can see, next year, without even doing the full main replacement, we're already going into the capital reserves. And really what this tells you is that in the
Well,
next...
can you stop there, though, Jim?
Okay.
Because that's not what we're proposing.
Okay, but-
we're proposing if council chooses to suspend the sewer lateral program, which is not this chart.
Okay.
It's the other chart.
Okay, and no, that would be if they do it permanently.
Right.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
that's what we're suggesting.
And then that would give you $700,000 a year to put towards the main replacement. Okay, that's what it would give you. But I think what really you need to recognize is that on our current plan, we're going to really need to adjust, in probably fiscal year 12, fiscal year 13, have a serious discussion about rates, because there's not enough to do the main replacement we need to do. The 4% is not going to get us there. I mean, we're okay now because we're above capital reserves this year. But really what this means is regardless of what you do in the sewer lateral, at some point in the next 2 or 3 years, if we want to get back to doing a decent main replacement program and meet our other needs, there's going to have to be a rate increase of greater than 4% in order to get us back into equilibrium. Everybody just needs to be clear
Can
about
I just
that.
work off of the other chart with you for a second? So if council chooses to go ahead and suspend the program, then beginning in FY15, you're building back up far more than policy reserves.
If you do no main
I
replacement.
understand.
Yeah.
I understand that. And if we spent another $2 million or $2.5 million on main rehab, then that whole line is moved down by $2.5 million, which still means that we'll be able to dig our way out of back to over policy reserve in those years. To your point, we would have to figure out something else to do by FY18.
Because what happens
Because
is,
I'm only suggesting to fund it for the first year.
yeah, if you only do it for 1 year, you're right. I think the problem is that you really at some point we're going to have to get back to spending around $2 million a year on main replacement, and that's every year. And so if you got rid of the sewer lateral program, then you still need $1.3 million a year of new money, and $1.3 million is about another 15-20% rate increase.
I understand that. It's just too late for this year. You guys already
Yeah.
sent out the Prop 218 notice. We can't do a higher rate increase. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that figuring out how to do our capital replacement for 1 year is better than 0 years. So I'm suggesting that right now we have the ability to fund it for 1 year, and that's better than 0 years. So let's fund it for 1 year, and in the meantime, figure out what evaluation of this plan we need to do.
But if you did your main replacement just next year in fiscal year 11, that number's going to go from right now it's at 4.8. It's going to drop down to 2.8 if you did the full main replacement.
Well, and 2.8 is just at
So you're going to
capital reserves.
you'll burn up all your capital reserves just next year.
Right. Well, again, if it's leaking sewer pipes, it's better for us to replace them now than to wait and split it over 2 years and replace some later and some now. I guess. Is what I'm
actually
submitting to you.
I want to make sure that we're not misinforming. It's not that they are leaking that causes them to be replaced. It's that mostly it's a problem, an issue of joints that have root intrusion that cause blockage.
I guess what I'm saying is that you more than anyone else in my life, Jim, have drilled into the need that front-ending capital is better than back-ending capital. So I'm suggesting that figuring out how to pay for it for 1 year is better than saying giving up and not doing anything this year. And I know it's not
I'm fine.
anything.
I just
it's none
want-
of that $2.6 million worth of water main replacement.
And I think on the broader policy perspective, you need to be aware and the council needs to be aware that if we really want to get back to the main replacement, at some point you're going to have to deal with a rate increase substantially greater than 4% a year because we're not doing the main replacement. We don't need to do it next year, but out in the future years, just eliminating the lateral program doesn't get you there. That's all I wanted to make sure everybody's clear on that.
I understand, and I think that this is going to take some more work in outgoing years. I mean that's no matter what we do today, it's going to take more work because the amount that you're going to have to replace of capital in FY18 is just too much for us to really, I think, plan for right now.
And as I said, this is a 10-year plan, and we will be updating the 10-year plan this summer as we go into the next capital planning program. And we'll be back to look at, and I think we'd like to come back with the 10-year rate plan to council to look at these issues in that context after we get through this fiscal, into next fiscal year, and look at all of these issues again. I'd like to know where we are with this revolving fund loan. That'll make a difference to the budget. So we haven't got all the information to make the next 10 years of decisions right now, but we are planning on doing that in the next year.
Great. Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those
I
in-
have some
sure.
questions first. With the 4% rate increase, how many dollars are we talking about added?
$1.28 on the typical.
No, but I mean, how many ratepayers, residential, what would that bring into us?
And I should have that information.
Where's my calculator?
Yeah, it's about $500,000, I believe.
Okay, so that's $500,000, right? And
Don't quote me on that.
roughly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we won't. Commercial rates are higher, aren't they?
Yes.
What are commercial rates?
I don't have that information with me. The way that wastewater rates are set, when they do rate studies, it looks at three components. It looks at how much water is being put through, what the strength of that water is in terms of a component called biochemical oxygen demand, which is how much energy it takes, and the other, how much suspended solids it takes. And then they look at the cost centers for the operation of the system. They look at how much it takes to do the collection system, which is flow related, and then different parts of the treatment plant have different costs associated with them. The BOD, the biochemical oxygen demand, it has a lot of energy costs associated with it. And then they look at the waste strength for the different types of users. And they look at the average waste strength for a household and the average waste strength for a business and the average waste strength for a restaurant. And they come out with how much it's actually costing to treat the water. So the fact that commercial rates are higher is because they have a higher strength waste on average than a household. And it costs more to treat it.
So depending on the type of business, you would be billed.
In the city, the rate structure that we've adopted has residential, commercial, high-strength commercial, and industrial.
Could you bring that when you come to
Yes, I'd be
council
happy
with that? And so I'm assuming that this 4% is across the board, commercial, residential, industrial. Okay.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Who do we have next? Waterfront. Can we take a brief second? Normally I can go out and get a drink of water, but because there's only two of us, that would interfere with having quorum. So maybe we could just take a 2-minute break.
I've got mine.
1,000 miles all the way. Get your kicks on Route 66.
You ready? All right. How's it going? Mr. Bradley.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Self, in comparison to Rebecca's very comprehensive presentation, we have our budget overview tomorrow in front of Council, so we're really just today going to focus on some of our budgetary challenge and how that relates to our fee increases.
That's okay. We're all used to Rebecca being an overachiever.
Looking at the waterfront department, a reminder, we're an enterprise fund, and generally what drives us is along the lines of the discussion you just recently had, where expenditures are what we're trying to meet with our revenues, because we're a service organization, we have aging infrastructure, and we have capital improvement projects that are significant almost every year. However, this year we're somewhat challenged also with a dip in revenue given the economy. A good example of that is our Marina One project. We're reconstructing our largest marina, over 560 slips. And as part of that, the department recently secured a loan of $5.5 million from the Department of Boating and Waterways. That's our newest debt obligation, which again forces us into our expenditure analysis. The good news is on that loan, it's kind of like a pay as you go. We only have to pay as we draw the money down, and as you know, the project is done in phases. So the first phase is under construction. We will pay an additional $143,000 in debt this year. But once the first three phases are completed over the next 3 or 4 years, our debt service will increase just on that project alone by almost $430,000 a year. Also, as you're aware, or at least Councilman Williams is, last year the department, as part of a structural change, took on some new projects and programs that were funded previously by the general fund, the community fireworks program, the beach lifeguard program, some additional restrooms throughout the waterfront, and that added an additional $250,000 annually to our operating expenses. So that's kind of the nutshell over the last year in terms of expenditure increases and what we're trying to address with some of our fee increases. Adding to that, obviously, with the economy, and certainly not to the magnitude of the general fund, which obviously we don't rely on sales tax, we don't get TOT revenue or property taxes. We get three main sources. We get slip fees, we get lease revenues, and we get parking revenues. We are seeing some downturn in the amount of percentage rent paid by our tenants. Certainly our lease revenue has shrunk over the last couple years. And on the fee side, our slip transfer fees are substantially off. In this economy, folks are not buying boats, and therefore when they don't buy boats, the slips don't transfer and we don't receive our transfer fee. Typically our transfer fees are about $600,000 annually. Last year we did not meet half of that, $300,000, and we had hoped by this year with a slight uptick in the economy we would get back to that level, but as of the first of the year we were just around that $300,000 mark, so we will be also off on slip transfer fees this coming year. Looking at just this year's current budgetary fee increases to compare what we're proposing for 2011, we did last year increase slip fees by some 4% for all slips, and substantially increased our parking program fees. In fact, we increased all of our parking fees throughout the waterfront, going from $1.50 an hour to $2 an hour, and increased our honor fee program and the rates on Stearns Wharf. The one fee we did not touch last year, and I don't believe we're at a point where we can, is our annual parking permit, in that when we increased it several years ago to $95, we began to see permit sales drop. So we believe we're at a point where that annual permit should not be increased, and we're not proposing that for, nor did we last year, are we proposing it for fiscal year 2011. And although we're hopeful that we've got about a month left, a month and a half, and we are seeing an uptick in revenues, we're unlikely to make that in our property management, probably be flat in parking, and depending upon what happens with slip transfer fees, we'll also probably be slightly off in marina revenues. For 2011, our proposed fee increases will be another 4% slip fee increase, which equates to about $147,000 a year. Just a little historical context on slip fees, and we have information here if you'd like to go through it. Typically, our harbor, our slip rates are below what other neighboring harbors are, Ventura, Channel Islands, throughout Southern California. As you turn the coast and go north, we're probably similar to our northern neighbors in Monterey, Santa Cruz, but certainly below the market in Southern California. That has been done for two reasons. Historically, if and when we do not receive our dredge funding, then we would have a resource to tap to help pay or offset some of those costs. And also by policy, the Harbor Master Plan says raise all other land-based fees before you increase slip fees so that you keep recreational boating affordable and commercial fishing sustainable. So that is kind of a history. We have not always increased our slip fees to the magnitude of 4% annually, but over the last several years, given the added cost and our new obligations for debt, we feel we need to be in this range. One other thing that we did this year, or we're proposing for next year, is a new category for 60-foot and above slips. These are our largest slips. We do not have a lot of 60s in the harbor, but we do have 60s, and then we have what are called end ties. Those are at the end of each dock finger, and those will be somewhere between 75 and 115 feet long. Historically, the 60s have paid the same rate as the 50-foot slips, and I don't have a good reason. That's just the way it's always been. We don't believe that's equitable. If it's a larger slip, then it probably should pay a slightly higher rate because it consumes more electricity with a larger boat, uses more water, and therefore the rate probably is commensurate to the size. So we are applying a new rate category for the slip fees, or for 60-foot and above slip fees. And I've got a spreadsheet. We can go over that with you if you'd like to understand the methodology applied there, but that should be somewhere in the magnitude of an additional $40,000 annually. We once again, as we have historically done, increase our slip transfer fee another $25 per lineal foot. We're currently at $250 per lineal foot. That would put us at $275 for each transfer that takes place. And with all of those increases, again, no parking fee increases this year, we'd be looking at somewhere upwards to $190,000 in additional revenue from those fees, as I outlined before. Looking forward, part of what you just had is a fairly in-depth discussion about capital reserve requirements. And I share Rebecca's viewpoint on the fact that you need both capital reserves for your capital improvement planning, your maintenance and repairs, but in my department we also need it for emergencies. As we did when Stearns Wharf burnt, we dipped into our capital reserves significantly, even though a majority of that was covered by insurance. When things, I've always said, when things break at the harbor, they typically break big, and therefore we have expenses and we need that capital reserve requirement. Tomorrow we'll present to you our capital reserve projections for 6 years, as similar to what Rebecca did. But that is something that drives where our revenues need to be in comparison to our expenses. And then the most recent thing that is
Mr.
kind
Bradley,
of,
I was just going to say one thing to reinforce your point is that if we did not get dredging funds one year, it's not as if we would have a huge amount of lead time on that. So we would need some of those reserves just to pay for the dredging. So that's One
probably
more.
beyond the capital reserve.
Right.
Yes, good point.
So, and that would be somewhere between $1 and $2 million just to pay for a year's worth of dredging.
About $2 million. And then last, as part of our new debt obligations, we have a debt service coverage ratio. We have one for our current debt, which is through our certificate of participations. That's where our main bond debt is within the department. And then we also have a new one now for the Department of Boating and Waterways, where they require that we have a 1.5 revenue to expense requirement. The best way for me to explain that to you is if we have surplus revenues after all of our expenditures, say in the range of $500,000, what we're going to have to demonstrate to DBA is that we're actually at 750 to have a 1.5 coverage ratio. So in other words, they won't be satisfied just having a $500,000 surplus revenue. They want to see that you have $750,000 as kind of a cushion in your projections for where you are. And I think Bob can explain that. That's similar for most bond type of arrangements. So one of the things going forward with our new debt is we're going to have to disclose where we are in our revenues versus our expenditures, and that we have sufficient coverage and surplus going forward. So with that, I would provide any additional information. Like I said, we do have our survey comparison to where we are in other marinas or harbors on slip fee rates, and I could go into details on the 60-foot and above new categories if you'd be interested.
Any questions?
Yes, thank you.
Councilmember Self.
Yes, thank you, Chair Williams. You were saying that boats that are 75 feet and longer, they hook up at the end of the marinas? Was that
Correct.
right?
It's what we call end ties. It's the very end. It's kind of a double slip. It's not, usually you have two boats
Right.
kind of pointed at each other. It would
Right.
be that outside dock.
Do they also have power and water and electricity?
Yes.
And so, is that considered a slip? Like the transfer fees and everything would be considered, it's just not enclosed, but it's considered a slip in your reckoning?
Yes, it's exactly like a slip. It applies whether it's on the end tie or in an inner docking system. It's similar, yes.
You just don't have
And-
that much room for 100 and some boats, 150-foot boats in a
Yeah, we probably
marina.
have about 15 different end ties that range somewhere between 75 to 100 feet that are used. We have some that are visiting, meaning they're not permanently assigned to somebody. We use them as visitor docks so that if some large boat is transiting the coast, we assign them to use that for an overnight guest slip.
And so they would pay a fee for doing that.
That's different, yes. It's called a visiting slip rate, yes.
Are you suggesting that the visiting slip rates go up?
I believe they are going, no, they're not going up this year. We raised them last year.
Okay. Is that based on the length of the boat also?
It is.
Okay. Thank you.
I have no questions. And you're looking for a recommendation from Finance Committee to Council? Is there a recommendation from Finance Committee?
I recommend that the 4% slip fee increase, the new slip categories. It's kind of hard not knowing what that is, but
We could show it to you if you'd like to, just a quick overview.
that's okay. We'll
Wait till tomorrow.
You're
And I
right.
guess the good news, that just to share with you, we sent letters to all of those individuals that would be affected by that new rate. We did not have anyone attend any of the Harbor Commission meetings that complained. I think they understand the rationale and application of that fee. So the good news was it made sense, and we did not have anybody complaining.
I would not recommend a slip transfer fee increase. showing that it's down and that this segment of boating is having a struggle anyway. I think to give that $25 a foot up, I would recommend that. But the 4% and the new slip fee categories.
Would you recommend that? Would we recommend? Can we agree to recommend the rest of the proposal and then ask Mr. Bradley to detail the rationale for a slip transfer fee at council?
Yes.
Okay.
I second that.
All right. So you have staff recommendation for the proposal, with the exception of the slip transfer fee increase, and just the request is to bring additional rationale for that to council.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, just for the record, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Okay, we have one more. This will be fairly quick, and this is for our solid waste fund. It's also technically an enterprise fund, and it provides services for trash and recycling services. And I just wanted to point out that our existing fees actually contain three components. The first component is really the major component, which is for the collection and disposal services provided to our customers. Those are the amounts we actually pay our haulers. We have two haulers, Marburg and Allied Waste, and those rates vary depending on what kind of service you have, how many containers, the size of containers, whether you're commercial, residential, or multi-unit. There's also a regional program fee that is built into the rates, and this is 3.25% almost, and we pay it to the county. And this is for services that are regional in nature, and a couple of examples are the hazardous waste collection at UCSB. That is available to all city residents and South County residents. Not sure what that was. Yes.
It's the computer.
And it pays for the e-waste collection that the county makes available at their transfer station. And so we pay them roughly $400,000 or $500,000 for those services. And then there's also a program fee, and that's the fee that actually is retained by the city and pays for our staff, the Environmental Services Division staff, who do contract administration but also provide a number of recycling and diversion services, such as our food scraps program. So we are proposing a fee increases only to the collection and disposal rates. So we're not proposing any increase to the program fee or the regional fee. And it's important to note that we really don't have too much control right now with respect to those fees. They are controlled largely by the franchise agreements. We have contracts with two haulers, and they dictate what the fees will be, at least how they are raised each year pursuant to that contract. The collection rate, which represents the costs associated with actually picking up the trash and taking it to the landfill, that portion of the rate is adjusted by the CPI annually, and I'll get more into that in a moment. The disposal rate, which is the cost to actually dispose that at Tehiguas, that's based on how much the haulers pay at Tehiguas, the tipping fees, and how much they're raised each year. So specifically getting into the collection charges, we are adjusting them by 65%. That's per the contract, and there's nothing magical about 65% other than that's the portion of the overall costs that are incurred by the haulers that is attributable to the collection services. At some point there was an analysis done early on that 65% of all their costs relate to collection, and the 35% relates to disposal. So that's why we apply a 65% of the CPI to the rates. And so we use a CPI from January to January. In this case, it was the January 2010 CPI, which was 2.276%. And so the rate increase for the collection portion was 1.5%, which is that CPI multiplied by 0.65. The tipping fee increase is based on the fact that the county at Tehiguas is raising their tipping fees by $4 per ton, effective this coming July. And based on our volume, which is an estimate, we expect to be paying or have to incur $210,000 in additional costs that we would pay to the haulers as reimbursement for their costs that they incur when they tip the trash, and that represents about a 1.4% rate increase. So in total, the rate increases for next year are 2.9%, which is 1.5 for the collection portion and 1.4 for the disposal portion. And I do want to note that the tipping fee increase, the $210,000, is spread across the trash rates, not across the recycling rates, which of course makes sense. So that's really it in terms of the rate increases. Again, no other adjustments to our program fees or regional fees. I do want to point out that more on a long-term or even a medium-term basis, that we are going to have to be looking at our rates for a couple of reasons. One is, as you know, this year Council approved shifting franchise fees that have been collected since about 2003 by the Solid Waste Fund, shifting it back to the general fund starting this year. So moving forward, we're going to lose about $440,000 per year. I know that the Finance Committee also asked us to look into a repayment strategy in concept for how the Solid Waste Fund would be able to repay the franchise fees that have been collected since 2003 through 2009. And so we'll be bringing back that item to the Finance Committee in about a week. But that's definitely an impact on the Solid Waste Fund. And as you also know, our recycling revenues have gone down dramatically. This year, 2010, we will be receiving about $800,000 from the sale of our recyclables that are collected in carts and cans. And the county handles that contract, and they handle the processing, but it's handled down in Ventura, Gold Coast Recycling, or MRF. And we're expected to get this year about $800,000. Next year, because of the drop in the recyclables, the values, we will actually be paying $37,000. So a dramatic swing in just 1 year. We do know that the markets are getting better, have improved dramatically, so we're expecting that number to rise back up to at some level over the next several years. I'm not sure when it'll get back to $800,000, maybe $500,000 in several years, but that's something we're going to have to contend with and deal with over the next couple of years. So we have no plan yet, but we will have to be looking at rates and hoping we can avoid raising any program fees to cover the lost revenues, but that's going to be something we'll have to evaluate. So aside from that, that really ends that. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Councilmember Self.
Yes, thank you, Chair Williams. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate this. When do we go to bid again with the carriers?
The haulers.
The haulers.
Mr. Chair, Committee Member Self, the contracts with Allied Waste expires in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, 13, June 2013. Thank you. And so within the next, real shortly here, we're going to start the process for those negotiations.
And
Right. So Marburg, our other hauler, has the opportunity to extend their existing contracts for 2 more 5-year terms, so that there's essentially the extension will start in 2013 as well.
so did we build into the contract a percentage increase per year? Is that how it was negotiated?
Yes, that's correct. Committee Member Self, in the contracts, it provides for the annual increases for the collection portion and, of course, for the disposal portion, and it's based again on CPI. So that's per the contracts, and they match. They're both the same.
Right. But at a time when, I guess that's considering labor costs, fuel has gone down significantly. I guess I just wonder about the wisdom of an automatic increase every year that we need to pass on to our residents. That doesn't somehow seem fair, because there is a fluctuation in the market. Sometimes things are more automated and become less expensive over time. And so to guarantee an increase, I think, is too late now, but it's, I think, something that should be considered in the future.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that at some point, the haulers, the contractors will want to have some provision for adjusting what they receive to account for the general cost of increases in providing services. The CPI that we've built into the contracts It's a pretty stable index, so it doesn't fluctuate much from year to year. We've seen some actually be in the negatives recently, but by and large, over a longer term, it's a pretty stable index. So which means that in some years they actually win and some years they actually lose. When, for example, the price of fuel escalated dramatically for them in the last few years, they really didn't get any compensation for that, and they had to absorb those additional costs that were well beyond the CPI. And so when they do decline, then of course, it may overcompensate them. But I think overall, it's a fair index to use to cover their general cost increases over a longer term.
Thank you.
And Mr. Samara, you're looking for a recommendation to council?
Sure.
Councilmember Self?
Well, I'm struggling with this because now they're talking about a food scraps program that I believe would increase the trash rate. It wouldn't?
No, if I could speak to that. The food scraps program was implemented this year. And so those rates became effective on November 1st of 2009, and that was a result of a rate study that was done. And as you know, when we did the rates, we wanted to provide incentives, and this is just for the business or the commercial sector. So we adjusted rates comprehensively to provide more incentives for people to recycle food and also for traditional recyclables. But on the whole, it was a revenue neutral rate change. So we weren't intended to generate any more revenues than we did in the prior year, but again, it's just to provide better incentives and then correspondingly penalties for those who don't recycle at a reasonable level. But that was this year. So next year we're not proposing any changes to those rates. They're going to be stable other than the increases I just described here.
Okay, because they were talking about doing food scraps for residences. I know it's not here yet, but then would they require added collection fees and...
Yeah, we're going to be potentially looking at a residential rate study and also evaluate how we could fold into that a food scraps collection program there as well, and then ultimately in the multi-unit residential sector. But that wouldn't be proposed until fiscal year 2012 if we did that. But it would be the same concept. We would want to see how much would it cost to introduce a new sort of material. The good thing about the residential sectors is that the idea would be that to use an existing container, which is the green waste container, to put both food and other organic materials such as lawn scraps, grass, and those kinds of things. So we wouldn't be really adding a new container, and then essentially we would be having the same route, pick up that one container. It would just be taken to a different location. So rather than being taken to the county's transfer station where that green waste is converted into mulch, that material will be taken to a local transfer station, and then it'll be picked up by the composter up north, just like it is now for the business sector. So there wouldn't really be a whole lot of added cost. It would just be a different service and a new service. And again, we would adjust rates to provide incentives for that program so that people are encouraged to do more recycling.
Well, I guess the problem I have with that, encouraging people to do that, is that we have one barrel, and that's it. So we're going to be charged for one barrel no matter how much goes into the other barrel. But then you would be penalizing many citizens in hopes that you get people doing food scraps. I have...
Yeah, if I could, I mean, we're getting really ahead of this because we're going to split
okay.
it. But
I get
what we
it.
did with the business sector, we didn't penalize those who had like only one container, and so we didn't see really any impact for the small businesses who had only a couple of containers or really couldn't do much with what they had. Because if there's not a lot of opportunity, we don't want to penalize them just for lack of opportunity, and so we didn't adjust those rates. So we kept them pretty stable. So there was no penalty there. It was just for the larger businesses in this case, and we would apply sort of the same concept to the residential sector as well.
And I would just indicate that if you're looking at this, how Mr. Samara has broken this down, the disposal rate for food waste is substantially cheaper than the tipping fees charged by the county. And so if we're looking at a residential, one would wonder if we really should be charging people who are doing a lot of food waste and whose therefore their disposal cost is cheaper, why we would charge them the same amount as everyone else. And so I would just ask you to think about it in terms of, if they're costing us less to serve, shouldn't they be charged less? But can we just get a recommendation on the staff proposal, which does not include the residential rates? And
I'm still conflicted. So you make it. I'm
okay. I will move the staff recommendation. And seeing no second, it would die, and there would be
Yeah.
no recommendation to council.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
if there's anything else you need me to provide you, either offline or to City Council
I'll be
tomorrow.
down at your door.
Okay. And again, our presentation is tomorrow as well, so we'll be getting into this as well
Yeah.
at tomorrow's budget presentation.
Thank you.
Sure.
We are adjourned.